Morning, everyone. Let's learn about React. Let's see. Ferris, do you want to read what's on the screen, please?
Sure. What's React? What is React? A declarative, efficient, and flexible JavaScript library for building user interfaces. It encourages the creation of reusable UI components that present data that changes over time.
Okay, so does everyone know what declarative means? Okay, so declarative versus imperative. So when we say something is imperative, we're saying that it describes how to do something. And when we're saying it's declarative, we're describing what to do or what you want it to do. So for example, if I arrive at a restaurant with Davey and oh, really? Alrighty. Who wants to be a host or a hostess today? Okay, Ferris, you're the host at a restaurant, and Davey and I...
What's your favorite restaurant?
That's a really tough question, and you're really putting me on the spot right now.
You raised your hand.
Just pick a restaurant that has servers.
Okay, Applebee's.
Applebee's.
You're going to be the host, and your line is, "Hi, welcome to Applebee's."
Hi.
And go.
Hi. Welcome to Applebee's.
Hi, my name's Dana. This is Davey, and we'd like to eat lunch here today. So can you please pick up 2 menus, welcome us to Applebee's, walk us over to that table over there, sit us down, place the menus on the table, explain what the specials are in the day, and tell us our server will be right with us?
Oh, we're going to need silverware. Napkins.
Yes.
I'm a messy eater, so make some extra napkins.
Okay.
Perfect. What's that an example of? Imperative or declarative? Imperative. I'm telling you exactly how I want you to do it. If we were to walk in and say, "Hi, a table for 2, please," I'm telling you what I want. That's declarative. Thank you, Ferris. So another example of that is driving a car. Who knows the difference between manual and automatic cars? So with a manual car, you have to use the stick shift, put the gas on, release the clutch, change gears. You're telling it how to do it, each step along the way. With an automatic, you just push the gas, put it in drive, and go. You're telling it what to do. That's declarative. So the way I remember it in my head is like, okay, it's imperative that I tell them each and every step along the way what to do. And then we'll be learning about the difference by making a web page. So for example, here I have a function. I say, okay, let's start with an array, empty array. Then go through that array, but first let I equal 0. And then tell it, okay, make sure I is less than the length of the array. And then increase I each time I go through, and then let the multiplied number equal an original array times 3. So I'm going through each step, telling them what to do. What's this? Imperative or declarative? Imperative, yep. Declarative. Map through this number, multiply it by 3. I'm telling it what I want it to do, not each step that I want it to do. Doesn't this look easier? So when we think about React, we also said it's efficient. So why is it efficient? Well, React creates something called the virtual DOM. So instead of redrawing the page every time something changes, it only redraws the objects on the page that have actually changed. So what React does is it takes a snapshot of the DOM, it creates this virtual DOM, and then when something changes, it looks at the difference between the two and only redraws those items that have changed. So that keeps it pretty efficient. In React, you also create reusable components so that you don't have to write code over and over. So there are 4 things that you need for a React app. So you need an HTML page with at least 1 empty element. Of course, you need the React library, so you have to import that. You need to have one or more React components. And then you need one JavaScript call to attach that React component to the empty HTML element from step 1. So what are components? You've seen this before. This is just your standard HTML. There's a header, some nav links. But wouldn't it be cool if we could write it just like this? So that's what React lets us do. So this is what a React component looks like. We have the component name, which is app header. It extends from something called react.component. There's a render method on it, and then it returns some what looks like HTML. But if you really look at that, there's a few things in there that are different. And it's actually called JSX, which is JavaScript XML. So who can find the two things in here that make this different from regular HTML? And I'll zoom in here. Does anyone see anything different than your just regular HTML? Yes. That actually is something that you would use in HTML, but good try. Yes? Okay, well, this is kind of a snapshot. Yeah, just a snapshot of a piece of the HTML, but yes.
This.props.name.
Yeah, this.props.name. We haven't seen that before, right? What is that? And it's in between curly braces. And it's just sitting there in the middle of that HTML. It's kind of weird. There's one more thing. What else? It's kind of, you might miss it, but look closely. What haven't we seen in HTML? Yeah, first. Class name. Don't we typically just put class? So let's take a step back. We use JSX in React, which is JavaScript and XML. So that first line, that H1, which says my site is the best, that actually becomes react.createElement with those 3 arguments passed in. So even though it looks like HTML, it's really not. It's really JavaScript, but it's a shorter way to write it. It's declarative rather than imperative. So here, class name, we have to use class name here because class is a reserved word in React. So if you see here, class app header extends react.component, we'd confuse it a little bit if we just use class. So we need to use class name. That's one difference. So this HTML looking thing, but is actually JSX, is actually this under the curtain. But it would be so much harder and more annoying to write it this way. This is actually only writing up to the 4th line. So there'd be, 10 more lines that you'd have to write like this. So that's what makes React really efficient, is you don't have to write. You can write it like this if you want to, but I don't think anyone does. There's no reason to, because it's just shorter and easier to do it this way. So something else that React has is something called props. So let's see. Bill, do you want to read on the screen?
Conceptually, a React component can be thought of as a JavaScript function. They accept arbitrary inputs called props and return React elements, describing what should appear on the screen.
Thank you. So basically, components are like functions. You could think of them like functions. And just like functions take arguments, components take props. And props can be anything: strings, numbers, functions, objects, arrays. So if you look at this example here, we have a function called alert me. And then we have our React component, my component, which is extending from React on component. Class component always needs a render method. It returns some JSX. There's a button with an onClick function. The onClick function is calling this.props.alertMe. There's a paragraph tag that says my name is this.props.name. Same with this.props.myfave. And at the bottom there is when we're calling that component, we're rendering it here. So what are the props in this example at the bottom? That bottom line, what are the props there? Think of how you pass things into functions.
Alert me is the function alert me up there. Except it looks like it's an object containing it, but I'm not sure yet. I might get that differently. And then my fave is true and name is Amelia.
Exactly. So those are the props. Alert me, my fave, name. And they're written like you would write an attribute in HTML. But if you want to pass something into a component, you pass it in using props. So we're passing the function alert me into my component so that my component then has access to that function. Same with my fave. And so here we're just setting my fave to be true, it's Boolean, and we're setting the name to be Emilio. Yes?
Why does Emilio not have the curly braces around it but the other two do?
Because it's a string.
So if props are strings, you only need quotes. If they're anything else, you have to have curly braces. And inside the curly braces is just any JavaScript expression. So you could put curly braces and then put quotes inside there too. But if you actually wanted to pass an object, you'd actually need two sets of curly braces. So alert me isn't being passed in as part of the value. It's just that the attribute value, the prop value, is a JavaScript expression, so you have to have curly braces. Basically, the quotes are just a shortcut.
So in this case, within my component, the button on click would actually just be the alert me function. And then it would show up as my name is Emilio and my favorite Boolean is true. Because we pass those values through as props. So props, like I mentioned, are received from outside the component, but they can't be changed within the component. So you use it as props if you just want to send data in. But if you want to modify the data, you need something called state. So if a component needs to keep track and modify data, we use state. And it's initialized in the component's constructor, and it's modified using something called setState. So in this example, we have our clicky counter component. Then we have a constructor method, which has a state. And that state is an object that's starting at 0. And then we have another function, update count. And here's where we change the state. So we couldn't here just say this dot state equals 10. We need to use the setState method. And in this case, we're increasing the state count by 1. And the reason we have to use setState is because that's what React listens for when it needs to update and modify the data.
So is it just when you do this dot state equals, do you have to put it all like within one object, or could you say like does it all have to be within the same curly braces? Or
Yes, but each property of it could be another object.
okay.
So like here, it's only one property count, which happens to be a number. But there could be another one that could be an array or something else. But ultimately, state is a single object. It could be an object of objects.
And an example of that is like in the update count function, you have this dot state dot count. You could have this dot state dot whatever else. You just have to call it that way.
This dot state dot spells.
Yeah. So then if you look at the return section, you'd have a button with an on click, and then that would update the count so that button has been clicked this.state.count times. Every time that button is clicked, it changes the state, it updates that state, it calls that setState method and updates that state. So that's how you would modify data. Again, you can't just reassign it a value because it won't recognize it. It's not listening for that. It needs to hear that setState or change the props.
It won't redraw the page, in other words. It won't update the user interface if you change state directly.
And then finally, you just need to attach it to the DOM like we mentioned. So you only need to do this once in your app. At the bottom there, you'll see React DOM .render. And this is where it's basically saying, okay, what component am I rendering? And that's the syntax for a component. Open caret app / close caret. And then where do I render that component? And if you look at, so the top part of this page here has a div with an ID of root. Your React component will have that. We'll just create a div with an ID of root. And then at the bottom, that last line is saying, hey, store that or put that app component in that element. So the top part of this page is HTML, like real HTML. It'll be your index.html document. Then there's the app component. And that last line is telling it, okay, render my app component in that div within my index.html. And that's where your app lives. Are there any questions? Okay, that's all we have. Sweet.